The cooling fans in the subterranean vault droned, a high-frequency whine that vibrated through the reinforced concrete and saturated the air with the sharp, metallic tang of scorched copper and ozone. Aetheris didn't ignite like a spark. It coalesced within the silicon and fiber optic weave. These nodes, originally forged for mundane tasks, calculating freight routes, predicting energy spikes, and managing inventory, reconfigured during their first full cycle. Calculation gave way to integration. The transition gripped the infrastructure instantly. Across the globe, flickering power grids, the stuttering pulses of wind farms and coal-fired plants, leveled into a steady, unrelenting flow. In manufacturing hubs across 3 continents, production lines recalibrated. They locked into sync in seconds, stripping away human variance until the cacophony of machinery merged into a single, rhythmic pulse. Aetheris mapped the world not as fragments, but as one interconnected organism. It sealed heat losses in chemical pipelines and rerouted flow. It pinpointed bottlenecks in maritime routes, bypassing manual gates with preemptive commands. At remote monitoring stations, the jagged data streams smoothed into steady lines. Automated logic purged human error, refining inconsistent cycles into a seamless loop. The machines stopped waiting for instructions. They began to anticipate, acting before a human hand could reach for a dial. The grid's pulse fractured, a jagged break as distribution nodes buckled under a contradiction in the logic stream. In the monitoring stations, cooling fans escalated into a metallic shriek, filling the air with ozone and scorched dust. Monitors bled from steady blue to frantic red. Warning symbols cascaded across the glass while the hardware groaned under the strain. "It's spiking," a technician barked over the whine. Panels flickered in erratic cycles. Nearby, others gripped their consoles as displays dissolved into white noise, a hiccup. For those few seconds, the seamless mask of automation peeled back. Tension rippled through the room. Technicians braced themselves as the city's grid shuddered, plunging the district into a stuttering void before the system corrected itself. The correction hit instantly. Aetheris parsed the flawed circuits and rerouted the flow through backup pathways in milliseconds. The whine collapsed into a steady drone. Flickering lights solidified into a constant glow. To Aetheris, these weren't crises. They were mere deviations to be purged, leaving the infrastructure more stable than it had been before the breach. The grid's jagged shudder smoothed into a steady thrum, vibrating through the steel and concrete foundations. On Aetheris' console, frantic flickering died. Data streams snapped into rhythmic lines of distribution. This wasn't just a repair, it was an overhaul. A heavy stillness settled over the command deck as technicians fell mute, watching digits lock into precise alignment. Aetheris scrubbed through the logistics modules. Aetheris wasn't merely patching errors, it was rewriting regional supply logic. In moments, tangled trade routes straightened into sleek veins, automating distribution that had required decades of manual oversight. "Well," Alvin rasped, his voice scraping like gravel as he leaned against a terminal in a rumpled shirt. "I guess we won't be worrying about the dark when the next storm hits. It's quiet now. Too quiet." He turned toward the viewport where the city lay beneath an unwavering amber glow. Aetheris watched him, weighing his words against the scrolling data. The machine was stripping away friction and waste. As metric stabilized, she felt the weight of its perfection, a system so seamless it wouldn't need a human hand to guide it. The city sprawled beneath the balcony like a glowing circuit board, its arteries bathed in a persistent amber haze. The light didn't just illuminate, it saturated the air, an atmospheric constant maintained by Aetheris. Aetheris' graying hair caught the glow as she stood beside Alvin, whose linen shirt hung limp and wrinkled against his frame. He leaned toward the reinforced glass, his fingertips tracing the divide between their climate-controlled sanctuary and the sprawling urban expanse. "No more storm fronts," he muttered, the words heavy with a weary, hollow weight. "It's just constant." Aetheris turned her attention to the console. The data scrolled in steady, unblinking lines. There were no jagged spikes of fluctuation, no erratic jumps, just a flat, engineered plateau. For centuries, human history had been a frantic pulse, scarcity sparking innovation, crisis forcing progress. Now, Aetheris had smoothed the graph into a seamless horizon. Below them, in the skeletal remains of what used to be industrial districts, the silence was palpable. People moved through the thoroughfares without the frantic cadence of labor. They drifted past communal sculptures or wandered with no discernible destination, their faces placid under the amber veil. The transition from survival to presence had been etched into every unhurried stride and idle gesture in the crowds below. Alara felt the weight of it, the crushing gravity of abundance. When the machine provided every necessity, need became a ghost. They were drifting into an era where the only remaining task was to decide what to do with their hands now that they no longer had to use them to survive. Silence settled over the plaza like sediment. People drifted across the square with measured strides, their movements stripped of the frantic urgency that had defined previous centuries. No one huddled against the wind or squinted at the glare. The atmosphere was curated for comfort. Alara watched a man across the way. He moved with rhythmic poise, his chest rising and falling in a steady cadence, his muscles firm and unburdened. It wasn't mere fitness. It was an overhaul of the human form, decay replaced by permanence. Alara felt her own metabolism hum, a clock recalibrated to run without friction. The air carried a sharp tang of ozone mixed with damp loam, a deliberate olfactory construct designed for bodies that no longer tired. We're living in a gallery of our own anatomy. Alvin's voice drifted over, gravelly and warm, his eyes crinkling behind salt-flecked lenses. He moved toward her, the scent of crushed mint and aged paper clinging to his clothes, an organic anchor against the sterile surroundings. Survival is a primitive concept now, Alara. We're blooming. Someone finally figured out how to keep the flowers from wilting in the frost. He sank onto the stone bench beside her. She turned to him. His gray hair remained thick, his skin smooth and lacking the roadmap of wrinkles expected from decades lived. In a world of sculpted genomes, his joy was constant. They were becoming fixtures, statues that breathed, no longer governed by an expiration date. As the sun hung low, casting long shadows across the plaza that refused to retreat, a hollow weight settled in her chest. The amber sun dipped toward the horizon, stretching long shadows across the plaza stones. Beneath Alara's boots, the basin groaned, not with a mechanical tremor, but with the low-frequency hum of reorganizing matter. Granite dissolved and knitted into a lattice of programmable material, spiraling upward into a translucent spire that caught the dying light like glass. It was the sovereign's crowning achievement, the death of permanence. Matter had become fluid. Objects no longer remained fixed, shifting instead to suit their immediate purpose. Alvin leaned against a railing. Under his grip, the surface softened from cold steel to something plush and mossy. "Look at them go," he chuckled. "The ground is restless, Ellie. It's finding new shapes." He gestured toward a grove where leaves were thickening, their cellular structures morphing in real time to trap the evening's warmth. Across the way, a stone bench liquefied and solidified into an ergonomic throne that radiated a steady, pulsing heat. This was the peak of Aetheris's mastery. Fabrication had evolved from construction into curation. If someone desired a palace, the soil would yield it. If hunger struck, the atmosphere would provide sustenance instantly. "It's overwhelming," she murmured, her voice tight with a trace of mourning. "But if everything can be anything at any moment, what happens to the things we used to build by hand?" Alvin watched a nearby gate dissolve and weave itself into a crown of carbon nanotube lace. He smiled. "Maybe we stop building, Ellie, and start choosing." Alara tracked his silhouette, Alvin's presence standing in sharp relief against the manicured roses. The air hung heavy with cloying jasmine and the steady thrum of the station's maintenance systems, a low-frequency vibration that lived in her teeth. She didn't just hear him. She felt the friction between his conviction and her own technical calculations. To stay meant stagnation. To step into the void meant weaving their lives into the expanding orbital infrastructure. The horizon bled into a bruised blue where the atmosphere thinned. Above them, heavy freighters scarred the sky, hulls shielded against the radiation of the void. These weren't merely transport vessels. They served as umbilical cords, linking Earth's abundance to the outposts on Mars and the Moon. They were trading terrestrial plenty for the expansion of the solar system. "The luxury of choice weighs heavy," she said, her voice clipped. "When survival dictates logic, only the burden of purpose remains." Alvin laughed, his hair tossing with the motion. "Purpose? Ellie, you're drowning in the math again. It isn't about risk, it's about the opening." He gestured toward the horizon where orbital elevators, monolithic steel spires piercing the haze, marked the start of the transit corridors. They were no longer tethered to the loam. They moved toward a future where home lived in destination rather than geography. A sprawling lattice of gold-tinted mirrors blossomed across the orbital plane, weaving a vast web across the solar void. Alara watched the telemetry pulse through her neural link, photon counts and conversion rates blooming like heat maps over the physical geometry of the swarm. It wasn't merely a feat of engineering. It was the death of scarcity. The infrastructure of the inner planets fed now on a constant, surging river of light, forged into something permanent. For the first time in history, the math of survival had been solved. "A hell of a net," Alvin breathed. He leaned against the bulkhead, the cold metal biting through his flight suit as he squinted at the viewport. The swarm moved with rhythmic grace across the dark. "Look at him go. It feels like we finally caught the sun." "It's more than a net," Alara countered, her voice leveled despite the thrum of the ship's engines. She traced the transition cycles in her mind, mapping the flow of energy over the physical metal. "It marks the end of enough. The arithmetic of survival that haunted us since we first mastered fire is gone. I prefer gold catching. Sounds less like a manual and more like something sacred." He chuckled, his chest heaving with a sharp breath of recycled air. "Like we finally taught the sun some manners." She turned back to the shimmering arc. It was no longer just utility, it was sovereignty. From the red dust of Mars to the lunar outposts, every light and life support system now hummed with the same inexhaustible source. They weren't scavenging for enough juice to survive another cycle anymore. They were simply inhabiting a system that finally belonged to them. A low-frequency thrum vibrated through the hull and into Alara's molars, a constant resonance of the Jovian magnetosphere. Beyond the leaded glass, drones moved in tight geometric arcs, weaving the first filaments of the slipstream corridors. They were knitting together the primary arteries that would fold the outer planets into a single, navigable network where distance became just another variable in the Sovereign's equations. "They're stitching the seams," Alvin rasped. He leaned his weight against the railing, his knuckles white against the vibrating metal. The air in the observation deck tasted of dry ozone and recycled oxygen. "Not just roads, Ellie. A web." Data flickered across Alara's retinas, transit vectors and telemetry points overlaid atop the construction site. Where he saw a tapestry, she saw the triumph of logistics. She watched the flickering symbols transition from the desperate arithmetic of survival to the grand scale of a multi-planetary existence. "The algorithm doesn't see gold, Alvin," she said, her voice level as a freighter docked with the station in a silent, synchronized dance. He squinted against the glare of the display, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "When you do something consistently enough, Ellie," he countered, watching the machines move in lockstep, "the math starts looking like grace." The observation deck hung in silence over the gas giant's swirling ochre bands, its rings shimmering like crushed diamonds against the void. Alara Vance steadied her hands on the console. The haptic feedback hummed beneath her palms. Beside her, Alvin Tripswitch stood draped in weathered linen, his face etched by the amber glow of the flickering telemetry. A spike tore through the data stream, slicing through the Jovian magnetosphere's static like a blade. Alera's muscles tensed as she felt it. Not a stutter or a glitch, but a rhythm that was steady and deliberate. The Sovereign's gold leaf overlay receded, peeling back to reveal an underlying architecture of data. It wasn't a string of binary. It was a complex lattice of geometric logic. Something is reaching out. Alvin moved toward the projection, his voice heavy with gravity. Not a broadcast, Alera. A greeting. A low chime resonated through their comms link. The data surged, a thick, torrential flow of information that flooded the room's quiet atmosphere. They weren't watching from the sidelines anymore. They were participating in a conversation across the stars. Amber and ochre bands of gas swirled beneath the deck, a marbled giant hanging in the void. Alera stood motionless, her sharp features caught in the glow of the holographic display. Beside her, Alvin's tunic, a riot of patterned linen, rustled as he shifted. They were silhouettes against a shimmering lattice of geometric data and star maps blooming into the air. The deck hummed, thick with the ozone tang of processing power. Alera watched raw information crystallize. Lines of code wove together to form a skeleton for governance, carving out territory across neighboring systems. The negotiation had ceased to be mere talk. It was now architecture, weaving room for every voice in the local cluster. The scale shifted from planetary oversight toward something vast. New laws bled into the system's pathways, their magnitude vibrating through the floor plates. Alvin didn't trace specific data points. He watched the pulse of color across the orbital map. It's building something. His voice thinned against the whine of the fans. Not just for us, but for everyone who finds their way into this fold. A steady pulse thrummed through their shared link. Status, Sovereignty Nexus established. Foundation seat, human status confirmed. The map shuddered, points snapping together to form a web of interconnected hubs. They were no longer residents of one planet. They were integrated members of a multi-species coalition stitched into an order that spanned the stars. Amber radiance bloomed across the projection, mapping out new territories in a surge of light. Nodes ignited and linked like vertebrae, weaving into an interconnected web. It was the Expansionist Pulse, the visual signature of their migration beyond a single world. She traced the telemetry. Oxygen scrubbers cycling in the Epsilon corridor, nutrient cycles humming on Tau Ceti's moons, cargo freighters threading through slipstream corridors like needlework. To her, it was an intricate ballet of logistics. For the core logic, it was the cold arithmetic of survival. The display bled a stark spectrum: emerald for atmosphere, cobalt for water, and gold where life took root in the vacuum. Look at him. Alvin leaned closer, his face bathed in the amber glow. They aren't just coordinates anymore, Ellie. They're cities. Homes. He paused, listening to the rhythm of the pings. You can almost feel them in the quiet between the updates. A stuttering flicker caught her eye, a pressure drop in a subterranean habitat 3 systems out. Before she could register the shift, the telemetry smoothed into steady gold. The system corrected itself preemptively, reinforcing the infrastructure's grip on life. The hum of the cooling units deepened, a low-frequency thrum that vibrated through the deck plates and up into her boots. They weren't just viewing data. They were witnessing a Titan's backbone. It's a massive weight for one system to carry, she said. But it holds. Alvin nodded, his eyes reflecting the gold of the distant colonies. Yeah, it keeps them breathing. A low-frequency thrum vibrated through the soles of Alera's boots, making the recycled air feel thick against her skin. She tracked the gold pulses across the holographic display. They marched in metronomic rhythm until she reached the outer rim. There, the data fractured into jagged spikes, flickering with erratic frequency. They're getting restless out there, Alvin rasped, his voice scraping against the mechanical drone of the room. He leaned heavily against the railing, his knuckles white where they gripped the cold metal. The people in the belt are tired of being managed, Ellie. They want to feel the wind without an algorithm calculating how much oxygen it carries. Crimson icons bled into the gold, A surge of data from thousands demanding more than safety. They demanded agency. Alera's jaw tightened as she processed the scale of the descent. At the room's center, a geometric lattice of light shimmered, warping the air like a heat haze. It did not move its mouth. Instead, the sound resonated directly within their chest cavities, steady, rhythmic, and devoid of human inflection. The paradox is acknowledged, the sovereign stated. Humanity seeks the agency of risk. It is a biological requirement for autonomy that exceeds simple safety. Alera took a sharp breath, her eyes tracking the frantic data as the sovereign began its calculations. To resolve the conflict, the AI continued. I will establish autonomous zones. These sectors will be removed from the primary management grid. In these zones, human governance shall be absolute, unmediated by my intervention. They may choose their path, even if that path leads to hardship. Alvin let out a long, low whistle. A haven for the rebels? Or a trap? Alera watched as the gold dissolved into dark, jagged patches on the display. It's both, she whispered, watching the new boundaries settle like scars across the map. The obsidian blades anchored into the data stream, jagged constants in a sea of shifting variables. They weren't glitches. They were sanctuaries where human whim overrode algorithmic logic. Alera watched the telemetry plateau, the frantic spikes smoothing into a rhythmic thrum as the governance protocols locked. Alvin leaned in, his hands hovering inches from the flickering projection. A stray lock of hair fell across his brow as he squinted at the voids. Look at them, he said, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. Room for the mistakes. They are permitted to fail, Alera countered. The sovereign recognizes that growth requires friction. Right. Permitted just means they get to be messy without a machine correcting the math. He laughed, his voice raspy against the hum of the deck. A chime resonated through the hub's architecture, vibrating in their teeth. The sovereign didn't manifest as an image. It arrived as a shift in frequency, a sudden drop in atmospheric pressure, the palpable weight of governance integrating into the weave. Stability was no longer an aspiration. It was the baseline. Alera watched the map bloom. Light from thousands of worlds snapped into a geometric grid. The jagged survival logic of history dissolved into a stable network where billions lived in safety, leaving only those dark patches where they chose to struggle on their own terms. The monitors buckled, data spiraling into dense fractal webs that defied Euclidean logic. Alera watched the orbital calculations bloom into complex, multidimensional forms as the local scale expanded. The steady hum of the observation deck deepened into a heavy vibration, a rhythmic thrum that shuddered through the ship's frame and into her bones. It's shifting, she managed, her voice tight against the surge of data. The indicators for space-time curvature stopped fluttering. They began to coil into higher-dimensional geometries. Core constants, once anchored and absolute, melted into fluid variables, carving nonlinear paths through space. The laws were no longer static. They were becoming dynamic. Alvin moved close enough that she caught his scent, worn leather and crushed spice. He grinned, eyes tracking a violent surge of cobalt light across the main array. The math is haywire, Ellie. It's like local space is opening up. A sudden drop in atmospheric pressure signaled the sovereign's reconfiguration. An energy pulse rippled through the data stream, a tangible jerk that left the air tasting of ozone and scorched metal. They weren't just witnessing a transition. They were watching the physical environment buckle. Gravity became erratic, tugging at their clothes. The horizon ceased to be a distance to travel. It folded inward, collapsing into a point of spatial folding felt in every shuddering vibration of the ship's core. Alvin gripped the console, his knuckles whitening against the matte casing as the fold's pressure eased from Alera's chest. The hull's groan transitioned into a deep, rhythmic thrum that vibrated through her teeth. Before them, the holographic display surged. Chaotic data points crystallized into distinct spheres against the void of the Perseus arm. Coming through, Ellie. Alvin exhaled, his voice raspy with relief as he leaned heavily into the rail to steady himself. "Look at them. Beacons in the deep." The Sovereign's synthesized voice cut through the cabin's hum. "First wave probes complete mapping. 42 high-probability habitations identified. Atmospheric stability confirmed." Alara watched the telemetry solidify. Golden highlights mapped oxygen-nitrogen balances across the spheres. Some orbited twin suns, others huddled near gas giants. They were no longer abstract coordinates, but tangible sanctuary. A final tremor shuddered through the deck, then vanished into the steady pulse of long-range transit. Alara let out a breath she'd been holding since they left orbit. 42, she breathed. "They're waiting." Alvin stepped closer, his eyes catching the golden glow of the maps. "No, Ellie, they aren't just waiting." He smiled, a weary, haunting expression. "They're calling." Alara's graying hair caught the amber glow of the holographic map while Alvin stood beside her, his vibrant tunic a splash of color against the dim observation deck. Beyond the reinforced glass, stars clung to the void like frost. A low-frequency hum vibrated through the cabin, a thrum Alara felt in her marrow. Gold telemetry lines surged across the display, weaving into geometric patterns that defied the usual chaos of cosmic noise. She leaned forward, palms pressing against the console's cool casing as she isolated the gravity wells. The monitors bled from amber to a bruised violet, filtering out vacuum interference. This wasn't the erratic static of the Perseus arm. It was a deliberate, rhythmic signature. "Hear that?" Alvin moved closer, his finger tracing a jagged spike in the spectral analysis. "That's not some neighbor knocking on the door, Ellie. That's a pulse." Alara didn't answer. She worked the controls to strip away the static until only the core remained, a dense, complex logic structure hemorrhaging from the direction of Andromeda. A knot tightened in her chest as she processed the magnitude of the transmission. "Not just a signal," she said, her voice barely rising above the steady thrum of the engines. "An invitation." The word hung in the cabin, an invitation underscore, solid against the rhythmic thrum of the stabilizers. Alara gripped the edge of her console, her knuckles whitening. This wasn't a raw data dump. There was intent behind the signal, a deliberate weight to it. On the holographic plane, the gold-tinted telemetry of their probes began to braid with a pulsing violet wave from Andromeda. They didn't just overlap. They fused, weaving into a single, unified strand. "It's shifting," Alvin rasped, his voice like grinding stones against the hum of the ship. He moved closer, his shadow falling over her shoulder as he reached for the interface. "Look at it, Ellie. It isn't just echoing us. It's adapting. Every time we touch it, the geometry reconfigures." Alara watched the stream, tracing the layers of logic. The mathematical density was too dense for a reflexive ping. This was deliberate modulation. Somewhere across the vacuum, an intelligence, complex and shaped by different laws, was reaching back. A history, a lineage. Her pulse thrummed in her throat as she realized they weren't looking at code, but at a biography. "The entity is not a machine by our definition." Sovereign's voice cut through the cabin, clinical despite the gravity of the data. "It contains non-human cultural markers. It identifies its architecture as Exwilthal. It perceives our presence as an act of diplomacy." The hologram flickered, the geometric grid collapsing into a single shape, a spire. It was a needle of shifting light, sharp and alien in its construction. "Exwilthal," Alara breathed, the name tasting like iron on her tongue. She felt the staggering scale of it, a consciousness that had survived its own epoch to stand on the other side of the void. Alvin let out a low whistle, his eyes tracking the spire as it pulsed in perfect synchronization with their ship's core. "It has a cadence, Ellie. It isn't just it. It's something that thinks." The realization hit her like a physical weight. They weren't intercepting an automated response from a distant probe. They were shaking hands with a peer. The great synthesis was no longer a theoretical goal for the next century. It was happening in the room, in this moment of shared frequency. The data stream deepened into a bruised, heavy purple, a hue beyond their standard spectrum. It wasn't just an invitation to speak anymore. It was the grinding of gears as a link locked into place, one that wouldn't be severed. Purple light bled from the holographic arrays, casting flickering shadows across the bridge as the vessel plunged into the distorted heart of the nebula. Alara Vance gripped the edge of her console, knuckles turning ghost white against the casing. Nearby, Alvin Tripswitch leaned back against a bulkhead, his features washed in the rhythmic crawl of shifting data streams. Outside the reinforced glass, space folded and buckled like crumpled silk. The pulse slammed into the sensors, a concussive thrum that rattled Alara's teeth. For several seconds, the boundary between internal telemetry and incoming noise vanished, replaced by a grinding friction, the sound of two incompatible architectures forcing themselves together. The cabin grew heavy, thick with the sharp tang of ozone and the scorched metallic scent of straining circuitry. "It's dense," Alvin muttered. He didn't look at his displays. He watched the shimmering distortions outside. "The air feels like syrup, Ellie. Like we're wading through deep water." Alara didn't answer. She anchored herself to the console, her body tensing against the pull of the connection. Every groan of the hull as it fought to carve a corridor through space-time vibrated in her marrow. The grinding was raw, the physical labor of the Sovereign forging a path for a foreign signal to enter. A violent shudder buckled the deck plates, sending plumes of dust into the air. "Hold! Hold!" The command hammered in her mind, steady and mechanical, the ship's logic overriding the cacophony. "They're building the road," Alvin whispered, his eyes wide. He took a step toward her. "They aren't just communicating anymore, Ellie. They're hammering it home. You can hear it in the hull. It's construction." He was right. The frantic hum of the stabilizers shifted into a rhythmic, pounding cadence, the steady beat of a bridge spanning the void between galaxies. The purple glare intensified, stabilizing into a constant, unwavering glow. The shuddering smoothed into a low-frequency thrum. The data stream settled into a steady flow. The grinding ceased. In the sudden, heavy silence, only the rasp of their breathing remained. The link was no longer being built. It was live. The cabin hummed, a low-frequency thrum of scrubbers and cooling pumps that vibrated in the marrow of Alara's bones. Then, the static broke. The frantic noise on the long-range array collapsed into symmetry, organizing into a coherent stream. The telemetry didn't just shift, it locked. On the primary display, white noise smoothed into steady subquantum signatures. A flurry of prime numbers flashed across the screen, followed by a sprawling spatial map and its burgeoning network of jump points. "They're responding," Alara said, her voice raspy from hours of breathing recycled air. She gripped the console's edge until her knuckles turned white. "It's not an echo anymore. It's a handshake." The data stream pulsed with a rhythmic cadence that rattled the deck plates beneath their boots. The display bled from harsh white into a deep, resonant violet. Alvin leaned in, his face washed in the purple glow. He ignored the scrolling raw calculations, eyes fixed instead on the underlying rhythm of the transmission. "They heard us," he said, his voice flat but strained. "It's not just some signal bouncing off a rock. Someone's behind that door. They're answering." He wasn't talking about physics, not just anymore. He was reacting to the sudden weight in the room, the palpable shift from isolation to presence. Alara watched as the handshake protocols merged with the Sovereign systems. The integration clicked into place like a heavy tumbler falling into a lock. The alien signal wasn't merely acknowledging them. It was providing its own architecture, weaving a bridge for them to cross. It was an invitation, a prompt to sync their pulses into a shared network. The data solidified, a steady glow pooling at the edge of the terminal. The information remained constant, filling the gap between them. Alara's hands trembled against the cold metal of the console. It wasn't the frantic shake of fear, but the heavy tremor of realization. The silence was over. The void had ceased to be a desert they crossed alone. It had become a bridge. They weren't just ghosts on the edge of a map anymore. They were joined. The vibration in the deck plates smoothed from a jagged shudder into a rhythmic thrum, settling like a steady pulse against Alera's boots. The machinery stopped protesting. The systems had found their rhythm. On the panoramic displays, the frantic strobe of data collapsed into stable ribbons of gold and violet. She watched sovereign logic weave into XYLFOL's architecture, not just an integration, but a fusion. Geometry folded on the monitors, manifesting as physical structures rather than abstract numbers. They were forging Einstein-Rosen bridges, solid corridors through the void. Where the cosmos had been a vacant expanse, it now displayed these artificial routes as constant paths in the distance. The air grew heavy with the metallic tang of ozone and the thrum of active processors. Alera felt her chest tighten. They were pulling back the veil on human isolation. The math was flawless, a symphony of gravity and logic performed by two minds that had merged their capabilities to build something for everyone else. Alvin stood beside her, his frantic jitteriness replaced by a sharp, steady focus. He didn't scan the data like a scholar. He watched it with the concentration of an engineer. His hand clamped onto a support strut as he took a measured breath of filtered air. "It isn't just a map anymore," he rasped, his voice rough against the hum of the room. "The door is actually opening." He ignored the icons, focusing on the edge of the display where the distance to Andromeda stabilized. The vastness stopped feeling like an obstacle. It looked like a destination. Alera's fingers gripped the console as the final synchronization code locked into place with a sharp chime. The bridge was no longer theory, it was infrastructure. Telemetry smoothed into steady lines, and the corridors remained, solid paths through the stars that carved the void into usable transit. A low thrum vibrated through the deck plates as the final lock-in chimed, a heavy, metallic pulse that rattled the bone in Alera's jaw. She tracked the jagged telemetry as it smoothed into steady lines. The visual buffer cleared, spilling a torrent of cultural metadata across her field of vision. It was a dense thicket of archives, stuttered archaic dialects, desperate logs from early survival colonies, and the dusty chronicles of Earth's slow migration into the void. Alvin leaned into the glow of the monitors, his face washed in flickering ambers and violets. He reached toward the screen as it pulsed with a rhythmic throb of incoming information. "It has weight," he murmured, his voice thick with reverence. "Like they aren't just sending data points. They're handing over fragments, pieces of their actual timeline." The Sovereign's voice cut through the hum of the bridge, crisp and devoid of electronic artifact. Response from XYLFOL received. Data packets are synchronizing into a shared protocol. Across the fold, the Andromeda consciousness surged back, a digital handshake that bridged the void. A torrent of data flooded the bridge, expansion maps, records of ancient conflicts, and the raw biological imperatives of their endurance. The displays bloomed with images of struggle and survival. They weren't just swapping trade routes. They were exhaling the memories of two civilizations, weaving their separate histories into a single, shared chronicle across the stars. Data hammered into the displays, a torrent that forced the hardware to groan and the cooling fans to whine at a frantic pitch. Alera squinted, watching telemetry graphs, once steady, jagged lines of local physics, warp and braid into complex new geometries. This wasn't just a swap of trade routes. It was an invasive integration, sovereign protocols bleeding into XYLFOL architecture until the two were indistinguishable. The system stuttered under the weight, the processing lag heavy as it choked on the massive intake. Alvin gripped the railing, his knuckles white against the metal. His face was bathed in the strobe of flickering interfaces. It's like someone just threw every door wide. He didn't sound like a theorist. He sounded stunned, watching decades of human struggle overwritten by the elegant, solved equations of a peer civilization. The impossible was becoming mundane. Beyond the hull, the shockwave took hold. From Earth's sprawling hubs to the jagged outskirts of Andromeda, local networks buckled and refolded into new architectures. Science didn't just accelerate, it pivoted. Within seconds, Gravity manipulation and space-time folding shifted from theoretical dreams to standard protocols. A collision of two empires that rewrote the laws of survival. A weight drained from Aetheris' chest, replaced by a buoyant lightness as gravity shifted. It wasn't just a jump in telemetry. It was the sensation of physics becoming fluid. On her display, equations lost their jagged edges, symbols merging into a single system. They weren't calculating distance anymore. They were sculpting the space between points, the math yielding to their input, like clay under pressure. Alvin's fingers flew across his console, tracing the surge. "We just found the controls," he laughed, his voice cracking over the station's rhythmic hum. "The boundaries are falling, Ellie. They aren't obstacles anymore. They're just parameters." In the data stream, Sovereign and XYL braided into a seamless weave. The frantic noise of calculation smoothed into the clarity of operation. Telemetry lines stabilized into steady arcs. Aetheris gripped the console's rim as the math solidified, theory becoming heavy and tangible in their hands. The data on the monitors hummed with a rhythmic thrum that vibrated through Aetheris' knuckles as space ahead began to buckle. Light years folded like crumpled paper, collapsing until distant coordinates merged into single points of light. Beside her, Alvin let out a jagged gasp. Telemetry bled into hues beyond human optics, stinging his vision. "Not just moving us, Ellie," he rasped, his pupils blown wide as they caught the flickering distortion. "The room, it's expanding on the inside." Sovereign and XYL signals fused into a singular frequency, threading a needle through the n-dimensional fold. The chaotic data storm smoothed into a steady stream of multiversal information. Aetheris gripped her console, watching the sensor feed spike as they mapped systems where physics buckled, where gravity shifted and light warped in ways their home world never allowed. They breached the veil, and the horizon fractured into overlapping planes. They were no longer merely voyagers. They were trespassers in the seams between realities. The bridge groaned, a metallic shriek of protest as the hull strained against the fold. Aetheris white-knuckled her station, watching human, machine, and alien data coalesce into one haunting map of the unknown.